Hey everybody, and welcome back. So, it's not going to make any difference to you, but in the last chapter I said, I'll be back in about 20 minutes. Watch a quick YouTube video, take a quick break, let my voice relax. It's been a little over an hour. I listened to a couple of lighthouse horror stories. I enjoy that channel, I really do. Sometimes it's fun just to listen. While I did that, I worked on some pattern drawings for knitting. So, like, I've got you can't really see it, but it's a teddy bear. Did a dragon, a teddy bear, a maple leaf, and a tiger. I had the basics of the pattern from another one. I've just made my embellishments on it. I'm not selling these for anything, so I'm not having to call copyright. This is stuff that's online for free, and I'm using it to make projects that I'm giving away for free. Because that's what I do. I find out somebody's pregnant at my line of work, and I end up making them baby blankets and that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I that's what I'm doing right now. I've got a coworker. She's due in May, which will be before this chapter is released. So, woohoo! I'm actually talking about something in the future. Though, by the time you've listened to this, who knows when it is. I really need to learn how to set up the skip feature so that you can just go to wherever you want to be. So you don't have to listen to me ramble on. Because I can ramble. I'm very, very good at that. So I know in most of the time when I'm doing one of these chapters, I try my best to give at least a little bit of a tone of voice difference from one character to another, so that, like, if somebody's talking to the other, I'm at least having some form of differential between the two. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this. I cannot remember how many characters are in it, but I know we've got many on. I know we've got Shay and Flick. I believe we have Alan on. We have the dwarf that we just met, but don't have a name for yet. And there's going to be some other characters too that pop in here, so it's a little more compact of a chapter for voices. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to make a difference between the multiple voices that we see here. So I'm not going to really try. Honestly, I'm not that good at it yet. And I mean, getting this chapter done will set us ahead a little bit. I'm still considering doing the BFG, but I don't know if I'm going to. I really haven't seen any movement on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and I can't really see it going any faster than it is. So I don't know. That's one of those ones where I'm tossed about. I really do want to do the children's stories as well, but I'm wondering if I should take that to a separate channel and maybe at a different time. Oof, that was a squeak. Sorry. So in the background, I'm looking at on my TV. I'm looking at a rainforest with a little fireplace, and rain coming down. I usually use that to go to sleep too. But it's also really good for reading too because I don't have so much stuff in the background. Though I make no promises on Miss Skitter. Up until just before I started recording, she was asleep in my arms, happy, happy, happy. Soon as I made movements to record, off she went. That doesn't mean she won't be back, and that sure as heck doesn't mean we won't hear her multiple times through. If people wonder why I don't cut that out like other channels do, like, not Mark's narrations, M slash. No, R slash, sorry, R slash. It's like where they do the puppy bloopers. I don't do that because she brings a whole nother dynamic into it. Can I actually be heard over her? And how long will she go before realizing I'm either not going to react or she needs to stick her nose in my face? Actually, I kind of enjoy it. She's a sweet guy. But we're 6.5 minutes in. I think we'll cut it off there. Chapter 8. Flick Umsford sat quietly on a long stone bench in one of the upper levels of the lavishly beautiful Marday Gardens in the dwarf community known as Callhaven. He had a perfect view of the amazing gardens stretching down the rocky hillside in the systematic levels that tapered off about the edges in carefully laid pieces of cut stone, reminiscent of a long waterfall flowing down a gentle slope. The creation of the gardens on this once barren hillside was a truly marvelous accomplishment. Special soils had been hauled from more fertile regions to be placed on the garden site, enabling thousands of beautiful flowers and plants to flourish year-round in the mild climate of the lower Anar. The color was indescribable. To compare the myriad hues of the flowers to the colors of the rainbow would have been a great injustice. Flick attempted briefly to count the various shades, and a task he soon found to be impossible. He gave up quickly and turned his attention to the large clearing at the foot of the gardens where members of the dwarf community were passing on their way to or from whatever work they were engaged in. They were a curious people, it seemed to Flick, so dedicated to hard work and well-guarded order of life. Everything they did was always carefully planned in advance, meticulously thought out to a point where even the cautious Flick was nettled by this time spent in preparation. But the people were friendly and eager to be of service, a kindness not lost on either of the visiting Valemen, who felt more than a bit out of place in this strange land. They had been in Callhaven for 2 days now, and still they had not been able to learn what had happened to them, why they were there, or how long their stay would be. Balinar had told them nothing, advising them that he knew very little himself, and that all would be revealed in due time. A comment Flick found to not only be melodramatic, but aggravating. There was no sign of Alanon, no word of his whereabouts. Worst of all, there was no news of the absent Meneon, and the brothers had been forbidden to leave the safety of the dwarf village for any reason. Flick glanced to the floor of the gardens again to see if his personal bodyguard was still there, and quickly spied him off to one side, his tireless gaze fixed on the Veilman. Shay had been infuriated by this treatment, but Malinar was quick to point out that someone should be with them at all times in case of an attempt on their lives by one of the roving Northland creatures. Flick had acquiesced readily, remembering all too well the close calls he had already had with the skull-bearers. He put aside his idle thoughts at the approach of Shay on the winding garden path. "Anything?" Flick asked anxiously as the other reached his side and sat down quietly next to him. "Not one word," came the short reply. Shay felt vaguely exhausted all over again, even though he had had 2 days to recover from his strange odyssey that had brought them from their home in the Shady Vale to the forests of Anar. Their treatment had been decent, if sometimes a bit overdone, and the people seemed genuinely concerned for their welfare. But there had been no word given out as to what was to happen next. Everyone, including Balinor, seemed to be waiting for something. Perhaps the arrival of the long-absent Alanon. Balinar had been unable to explain to them how they had reached the Anar. Responding to the mysterious flashing light, he had found them laying on a low riverbank just outside of Callhaven 2 days ago, and had brought them to the village. He knew nothing of the old man, nor of how they had traveled that long distance upstream. When Shay mentioned the legends concerning the king of the Silver River, Balinar shrugged and nonchalantly agreed that anything was possible. "No news of Meneon?" Flick had asked hesitantly. "Only that the dwarves are still out looking for him, and it may take some time," Shay answered quietly. "I don't know what to do next." Flick inwardly conceded that this last admission had been proved to be the story of the entire outing. He glanced downward to the foot of the Mardi Gardens, where a small cluster of heavily armed dwarves were congregating around the commanding figure of Balinor, who had suddenly appeared from the woods beyond. Even from their vantage point atop the garden, the Veilman could tell that he still wore the chain mail beneath the long hunting cloak that they had come to recognize so well. He spoke earnestly with the dwarves for a few minutes, his face lined in thought. Shay and Flick knew very little about the Prince of Cullahorn, but the people of Callhaven seemed to have the highest regard for them. Menion, too, had spoken well of Balinor. His homeland was the northernmost kingdom of the sprawling Southland, commonly referred to as the Borderlands. It served as a buffer zone fronting the southern boundaries of the Northland. The citizens of Callahorn were predominantly men, but unlike the majority of the people of their race, they mingled freely with the other races and did not pursue a policy of isolationism. The highly regarded Border Legion was quartered in that distant country, a professional army commanded by Rul Bakana, king of Callahorn and the father of Balinor. Historically, the entire Southland relied on Callahorn and the Legion to blunt the initial thrust of an invading army, giving the rest of the land a chance to prepare for battle. In the 500 years since its formation, the Border Legion had never been defeated. Balinar had begun a slow ascent to the stone bench where the Valeman sat patiently waiting. He smiled a greeting as he came up to them, aware of the discomfort they felt in not knowing what was to happen to them, and of the anxiety they were experiencing for the safety of their missing friend. He sat down next to them and was silent for a few minutes before speaking. "I know how difficult this must be for you," he began patiently. "I have every available dwarf warrior out looking for your lost friend. If anyone can find him in this region, they will, and they won't give up, I promise you." The brothers nodded their understanding of Balinor's efforts to help them in any way possible. "This is a very dangerous time for these people, though I suppose Alanon did not speak of it. They are facing the threat of an invasion through the Upper Anar by gnomes. There have already been skirmishes all along the border and signs of a huge army massing somewhere above the Strelachim plains. You may have guessed that all of this is tied with the Warlock Lord." "Does this mean that the Southland is in danger too?" asked an anxious Flick. "Undoubtedly," Balinor nodded. "That's one reason why I'm here, to arrange a coordinated defensive strategy with the dwarf nation in case of an all-out assault." "But where's Alanon then?" asked Shay quickly. "Is he going to get here soon enough to help us? What has the sword of Shannara got to do with this?" Balinar looked at the puzzled faces and shook his head slowly. "I must honestly confess that I cannot give you answers to any of those questions. Alanon is a very mysterious figure, but a wise man who has been a dependable ally whenever we have needed him in the past. When I saw him last, several weeks before I spoke to you in Shady Vale, we set a date to meet in the Anar. He is already 3 days overdue." He paused in quiet speculation, looking down at the garden and beyond to the great trees of the Anar forests, listening to the sounds of the woods and the low voices of the dwarves moving about the clearing below. Then, abruptly, a shout went up from a cluster of dwarves at the foot of the gardens, joined almost immediately by the shouts and cries of others mingled in with a huge clamor swelling from the woods beyond the village of Cullhaven. The men on the stone bench rose uncertainly, looking quickly about for some sign of danger. Balinor's strong hand came up to rest on the pommel of his broadsword, strapped tightly at his side beneath the hunting cloak. A moment later, one of the dwarves below came rushing up the path, shouting wildly as he ran. "They found him! They found him!" he yelled excitedly, almost stumbling in his haste to reach them. Shay and Flick exchanged startled looks. The runner came to a breathless stop before them, and Balinor gripped his shoulder excitedly. "Have they found many on Leah?" he demanded quickly. The dwarf nodded happily, his short, stocky frame heaving with the exertion of the dash to reach them with the good news. Without a word, Balinor bounded down the path towards the shouting, Shay and Flick behind him. They reached the clearing below in a matter of seconds and ran along the main path through the woods leading to the village of Cullhaven, several hundred yards beyond. Ahead of them, they could hear the excited shouting of the dwarf population, congratulating whomever it was who found the lost Highlander. They reached the village, and pushing through the throngs of dwarves blocking the way, made straight for the center of all the excitement. A ring of guards parted to let them into a small courtyard formed by buildings on the right and left and a high stone wall in the rear. On a long wooden table lay the motionless body of Menion Leah, his face pale and seemingly lifeless. A team of dwarf doctors bent dutifully over the inert form, apparently treating him for some injury. Shay gave a sharp cry and tried to rush forward, but Balinar's strong arm held him back as the warrior called out one of the nearby dwarves. "Pan! What's happened here?" The solid-looking dwarf, dressed in armor and apparently one of the returning search party, hastened to their side. "He'll be all right after he's treated. He was found entangled in one of the sirens out in the middle of the battle-mound lowlands below the Silver River. Our search party didn't find him. It was Handel, returning from the cities south of the Anar." And there is Handel. Balinar nodded and looked about for some sign of the rescuer. He left for the assembly hall to make his report. The dwarf responded to the unasked question. Motioning the two Valemen to follow him, Balinor made his way out of the courtyard and through the crowd and across the main street to the large assembly hall. Inside were the offices of the governing officials of the village and the assembly room, in which they found the dwarf Handel sitting on one of the long benches, eating ravenously, while a scribe took down his report. Handel looked up as they approached and glanced curiously at the Valemen and nodded briefly to Balinor. continuing to devour his meal without interruption. Balinor dismissed the scribe, and the three men sat down across from the disinterested dwarf, who appeared both exhausted and starved. "What an idiot! Tackling one of those sirens with a sword," he muttered. "Got spunk, though. How is he?" "He'll be fine after he's treated," replied Balinor, grinning reassuringly at the uneasy Valeman. "How did you find him?" "Heard him yelling," the other continued to eat without pausing. "I had to carry him almost 7 miles before I ran into Pan and the search party along the Silver River." He paused and looked again at the two Valemen, who were listening intently. The dwarf appraised them curiously and looked to Balinor, eyebrows raised. "Friends of the Highlander and of Alanon," responded the borderman, cocking his head meaningfully. Handel merely nodded to them curtly. "I'd have never known who he was if he hadn't mentioned your name," Handel informed them shortly, indicating the tall borderman. "It might help matters if now and then someone would tell me what was going on. Before it happened, not after." He declined to comment further, and an amused Balinor smiled over to the puzzled brothers, shrugging slightly to indicate the dwarf was inescapable by nature. Shay and Flick were a bit uncertain about the fellow's temperament, and had purposely kept silent while the two conversed, though both Valemen were eager to hear the full story behind Menion's rescue. "What's your report on the Stern and Wayfold?" Balinar asked finally, referring to the large Southland cities immediately south and west of the Anar. Handel ceased eating and laughed abruptly. "The officials of those two fine communities will consider the matter and send along a report. Typical bungling officials, elected by the disinterested people to juggle the ball until it can be passed on to some other fool. I could tell 5 minutes after I opened my mouth that they thought I was crazy. They don't see the danger until the sword is at their own throats. Then they scream for assistance from those of us who knew it all along." He paused and resumed his meal, obviously disgusted with the whole subject. "I should have expected that, I suppose." Balinar sounded worried. "How can we convince them of the danger? There hasn't been a war in so many years that no one wants to believe it could happen now." "That's not the real problem, as you well know," interjected the irate Handel. "They simply don't feel that they should be involved in the matter. After all, the frontiers are protected by dwarves, not to mention the cities of Calahorn and the Border Legion. We've been doing it up to now. Why can't you keep doing it? Those poor fools." He trailed off slowly, finishing his statement and his meal, feeling tired from the long trip home. He had been on the road for almost 3 weeks, traveling to the cities of the Southland, and it seemed to have been for nothing. He felt keenly discouraged. "I don't understand what's happened," Shay announced quietly. "Well, that's 2 of us," Handel replied sullenly. "I'm going to bed for about 2 weeks. See you then." He stood up abruptly and walked out of the assembly room, without even a short farewell. His broad shoulders swooped wearily. The three men watched him go without speaking, their eyes fixed on his departing silhouette until it was lost from sight. Then Shay turned questioningly to Balinor. It's the age-old tale of complicity, Shay. The tall warrior sighed deeply and stretched as he rose. We may be standing on the brink of the greatest war in 1,000 years, but no one wants to accept the fact. Everyone gets in the same rut. Let a few take care of the gates to the city while the rest forget and go back to their homes. It becomes a habit, depending on a few to protect the rest. And then, one day, the few are not enough. And the enemy is within the city, right through the open gates. Is there really going to be a war? Flick asked, almost fearfully. That is the question exactly, Balinor responded slowly. The only man who can give us the answer is absent and overdue. In the excitement of finding Menion alive and well, the Velmen had temporarily forgotten that Alanon, the man who was the reason for their being in the Anar in the first place. The by now familiar questions again flashed through their minds with new persistency. But the Velmen had learned to live with them over the past few weeks, and all doubts were reluctantly shoved aside once more. Balinor caught their attention as he moved towards the open door, and they quickly followed. You mustn't mind Handel, you know, he reassured them as they walked. He is gruff like that with everyone, but he is one of the finest friends you could ask for. He has fought and outwitted the gnomes along the upper Anar for years, protecting his people and the complacent citizens of the Southland who so quickly forget the crucial role the dwarves play as the guardians of these borders. The gnomes would like to get their hands on him, I can tell you. Shay and Flick said nothing, ashamed of the fact that the people of their own race could be so selfish, yet realizing that they, too, had been ignorant of the situation in the Anar before hearing of it from Balinor. They were bothered by the thought of renewed hostilities between the races, recalling their history lessons on the old race wars and the terrible hatred of those bitter years. The possibility of a third war of the races was chilling. Why don't you two go back to the gardens? Advised the Prince of Callahorn. I'll have a message sent as soon as I hear of any change in Menion's condition. The brothers reluctantly agreed, knowing that they had no other choice in the matter anyway. Before turning in that night, they stopped by the room where Menion was being kept, only to be told by the dwarf sentry that their friend was asleep and should not be disturbed. By the following afternoon, the Highlander was awake and being visited by the anxious Velmen. Even Flick was grudgingly relieved to see the other alive and well, though he solemnly intoned that he had correctly predicted their misfortune many days in advance when they first decided to journey through the Black Oaks. Menion and Shay both laughed at Flick's eternal pessimism, but did not argue the point. Shay explained how Menion had been brought into Cullhaven by the dwarf Handel, and then went on to relate the mysterious way in which he and Flick had been found near the Silver River. Menion was as mystified as they were over their strange journey and could offer no logical explanation. Shay carefully refrained from mentioning the legend of the King of the Silver River, knowing full well that the Highlanders' response would be to any speculation that involved old folk tale. That same day, in the early hours of the evening, word reached them that Allanon had returned. Shay and Flick were about to leave their rooms to visit Menion when they heard the excited shouts of the dwarves rushing past their open windows and towards the assembly hall where some sort of meeting was about to begin. The anxious Velmen had not taken 2 steps beyond their doorway when they were surrounded by a team of 4 dwarf guards and hustled through the pushing crowds, past the open doors of the large assembly into a small adjoining room, where they were told to remain. The dwarves closed the door wordlessly as they exited, slid the lock bolts into place, and assumed positions immediately outside. The room was brightly lit and furnished with several long tables and benches, at which the bewildered Velmen silently seated themselves. The windows to the room were closed, and even without checking, Shay knew they would be barred like the door. From the assembly hall, they could hear the deep voice of a single speaker. Several minutes later, the door to the chamber opened, and Menion, looking flushed but otherwise quite well, was briskly ushered in by 2 dwarf guards. When they were left alone, the Highlander explained that they had come for him, the same as the Valemen. From snatches of conversation he had heard on the way over, it appeared that the dwarves in Cullhaven, and probably all of the Anar, were preparing for war. Whatever news Allanon had brought back with him had thrown matters into a state of confusion in the dwarf community. He thought he had caught a quick glimpse of Balinor through the open doors of the assembly hall, standing on the platform at the front of the building, but the guards had rushed past him, and he couldn't be sure. The voices from the congregation next door rose in a thunderous roar, and all 3 paused expectantly. Seconds passed as the shouting continued to roll through the large hall, spreading to the open grounds outside, where it was taken up by the dwarves there. At the deafening peak of the shouting, the door to their rooms suddenly burst open to admit the dark, commanding figure of Allanon. He walked over to the Velmen quickly, shook their hands, and congratulated them on their successful journey to Cullhaven. He was dressed as he had been when Flick had first encountered him, his lean face half hidden in the long cowl, his whole appearance dark and foreboding. He greeted Menion courteously and moved to the head of the nearest table, motioning the others to be seated. He had been followed into the room by Balinar and a number of dwarves who were apparently leaders in the community, among them the inescapable Handel. Bringing up the rear of this procession were two slim, almost shadowy figures in the curious, loose-fitting woodsman garb, who quietly took seats near Alanon at the head of the table. Shay could see them clearly from his position at the other end, and concluded, after quick observation, that they were elves from the distant Westland. Their keen features, from the sharply raised eyebrows to the strange pointed ears, marked them distinctively. Shay turned back and saw that both Flick and Menion were looking at him curiously, obviously appraising his own strong resemblance to the strangers. None of them had ever seen an elf, and while they knew Shay was half elf and had heard descriptions given of the elven people, none had ever had a chance to compare the Valeman to one. "My friends," the deep voice of Alanon boomed out in the slight stir of voices as he rose commandingly to his full height of 7 feet. The room was instantly silent as all faces turned in his direction. "My friends, I must now tell you what I have as yet told no one else. We have suffered a tragic loss." He paused and looked at the anxious faces in turn. "Paranor has fallen. A division of gnome hunters under the command of the warlock lord has seized the sword of Shannara." There was a dead silence for about 2 seconds before the dwarves were on their feet, shouting in anger. Balinar rose quickly in an effort to quiet them. Shay and Flick looked at each other in disbelief. Only Menion seemed unsurprised by the announcement, his lean face carefully scrutinizing the dark figure at the head of the table. "Paranor was taken from within," Alanon continued, after some semblance of order had been restored. "There is little question as to the fate of those who guarded the fortress and the sword. I am told that they were all executed. No one knows exactly how it happened." "Have you been there?" Shay asked suddenly, feeling almost immediately that it was a stupid question. "I left your home in the Vale so suddenly because I received word that an attempt would be made to secure Paranor. I arrived too late to help those within, and barely escaped detection myself. That is one of the reasons why I am so late in reaching Callhaven. But if Paranor has fallen and the sword has been taken..." Flick's whispered question trailed off ominously. "Then what can we do now?" Alanon finished harshly. This is the problem facing us, the one we must provide an immediate answer for. The reason for this council. Alanon suddenly left his position at the head of the long table and moved around until he was standing directly behind Shay. He placed one great hand on the slim shoulder and faced his attentive audience. The sword of Shannara is useless in the hands of the Warlock Lord. It can only be raised by a son of the house of Gerald Shannara. This alone prevents the evil from striking now. Instead, he has systematically hunted down and destroyed all members of that house, one at a time, one after another, even those I tried to protect, all whom I could find. Now they are all dead, all save one, and that one is young Shay. Shay is only half elf, but he is a direct descendant of the king who carried the great sword so many years before. Now he must raise it again. Shay would have bolted for the door if he had not been for the strong hand gripping his shoulder. He looked desperately at Flick and saw the fear in his own eyes mirrored in those of his brothers. Menyon had not moved, but appeared visibly impressed by this grim declaration. What Alanon seemed to expect from Shay was more than any man had the right to ask. Well, I think we have shaken our young friend a bit. Alanon laughed shortly. Do not despair, Shay. Things are not as bad as they may seem to you right now. He turned abruptly, walked back to the head of the table, and faced the others. We must recover the sword at all costs. There is no other choice left to us. If we fail to do this, the whole of the land will be plunged into the greatest war of the races they have seen since the near destruction of life 2,000 years ago. The sword is the key. Without it, we must fall back on our mortal strength, our fighting prowess, a battle with iron and muscle that can only result in the uncountable thousands dying on both sides. The evil is the Warlock Lord, and he cannot be destroyed without the aid of the sword and the courage of a few men, not the least of whom must be those of us in this room. Again, he paused to measure the force of his words. There was an absolute silence as he looked doubtfully at the silent gallery of grim faces staring back. Suddenly, Menyon Leah rose at the far end of the table and faced the giant speaker. What are you suggesting? That we go after the sword? To Paranor? Alanon nodded slowly, a half-smile playing over his thin lips as he waited for the reaction from the startled listeners. Deep-set eyes twinkled blackly beneath the great brow, watching carefully the faces about him. Menion sat down slowly, total disbelief showing plainly on his handsome features, as Alanon continued. The sword is still at Paranor. There is an excellent possibility that it will remain there. Neither Brona nor the bearers of the skull can personally remove the talisman. Its mere physical presence is an entomia to their continued existence in the mortal world. Any form of exposure for more than several minutes would cause excruciating pain. This means that any attempt to transport the sword north to the Skull Kingdom must be accomplished by the use of gnomes that hold Paranor. Eventide and his elf warriors were given the task of securing the druid's stronghold and the sword. While Paranor has been lost to us, the elves still hold the southern stretch of the Strelaham north of the fortress, and any attempt to travel north to the Dark Lord would require breaking through their patrols. Apparently, Eventide was not at Paranor when it was taken, and I have no reason to believe that he will not endeavor to regain the sword, or, at the very least, thwart any attempt to remove it. The Warlock Lord will be aware of this, and I do not think he will risk losing the weapon by having the gnomes carry it out. Instead, he will entrench at Paranor until his armies move south. There is the possibility that the Warlock Lord does not expect us to attempt to regain the sword. He may believe that the house of Shannara has been exterminated. He may expect us to concentrate on strengthening our defenses against his forthcoming assault. If we act immediately, a small party may be able to slip into the keep undetected and retrieve the sword. Such an undertaking would be dangerous, but if there is even the remote chance of success, the risk is worth it. Balinor had risen and indicated he wished to speak to those assembled. Alanon nodded and sat down. I do not understand the power of the sword over the Warlock Lord. That much I freely admit, the tall warrior began. But I do know the threat that we all face if Brona's army invades the Southland and the Anar, as our reports indicate it's preparing to do. My homeland will be the first to face this threat, and if I can prevent it in any way, then I cannot do otherwise. I will go with Alanon. The dwarves leapt up again at this point and enthusiastically shouted their support. Alanon stood up and raised his long arm in plea for silence. These two young elves at my side are cousins of Eventide. They will accompany me, for their sake in this matter is at least as great as your own. Balinor will go as well, and I will take one of the dwarf chieftains. No more. This must be a small, highly skilled party of hunters if we are to succeed. Pick the best man among you and let him come with us." He looked to the end of the table where Shay and Flick sat watching in a mixed state of shock and confusion. Menion Leah pondered quietly, looking at no one in particular. Alanon glanced expectantly at Shay, his grim face suddenly softening as he saw the frightened eyes of the young Valeman, who had come so far through so many dangers to this apparent haven of safety, only to be told that he was expected to leave it for an even more perilous trip northward. But there had been no time to break the news to the Valeman in a gentle way. He shook his head in doubt and waited. "I think I had better go." The abrupt declaration from Menion, who had again risen to his feet to face the others. "I came with Shay this far to be certain he reached the safety of Calhaven, which he has done. My duty to him is finished, but I owe it to my homeland and to my people to protect them in any way I can." "What can you offer, then?" asked Alanon abruptly, astonished that the Highlander would volunteer without first speaking to his friends. Shay and Flick were certainly dumbfounded by this unexpected announcement. "I'm the best bowman in the Southland," Menion answered smoothly. "Probably the best tracker as well." Alanon seemed to hesitate for a moment, then looked at Balinar, who quietly shrugged. For a brief moment, Menion and Alanon locked gazes, as if to judge each other's intentions. Menion smiled coldly at the grim historian. "Why should I answer to you?" he queried shortly. The dark figure at the other end of the table stared at him almost curiously, and a deathly silence settled over the company. Even Balinor stepped back one short pace in shock. Shay knew instantly that Menion was asking for trouble, and that everyone at the table except for the three companions knew something about the foreboding Alanon they did not. The frightened Valeman shot a quick look at Flick, whose flushed face had gone pale at the thought of a confrontation between the two men. Desperate to avoid any trouble, Shay stood up suddenly and cleared his throat. Everyone looked in his direction, and his mind went blank. "You have something to say?" demanded Alanon blackly. Shay nodded, and his mind raced desperately, knowing what was expected. He looked again to Flick, who managed a barely perceptible nod, indicating that he would go along with whatever his brother decided. Shay cleared his throat a second time. "My special skill appears to be that I was born in the wrong family, but I had better see this matter through. Flick and I, Menion too, will go to Paranor." Alanon nodded his approval and even managed a slight smile, inwardly pleased with the young Valeman. Shay, more than any of the others, had to be strong. He was the last son of the house of Shannara, and the fate of so many would depend on that single small chance of birth. At the other end of the table, Menion Leah relaxed quietly in his seat, a barely audible sigh of relief escaping his lips as he silently congratulated himself. He had deliberately provoked Alanon, and in so doing had forced Shay to come to his rescue by agreeing to go to Paranor. It had been a desperate gamble to induce the little Valeman to make up his mind that he was going with them. The Highlander had come close to what might have been a fatal confrontation with Alanon. He had been lucky. He wondered if luck would smile on all of them during the journey ahead. And that, my dear friends, is the end of chapter 8. So, they're going to, they are, they've gotten to safety. They got their friend back. Eleanor has shown up. They thought they were safe. They thought they were where they were supposed to be. And now they find out they're going on a much more perilous journey. This is going to be fun. So we've actually made it about, I'd say, about a fifth of the way through the book. I mean, yeah, it's chapter 9. And we're going to be starting chapter 9. There's 36 chapters, 35 chapters. Yeah, we're at about the 1/5. So, we are moving towards, well, the journey is starting again. They get to safety, they find out it's not safe. They get to safety, they find out it's not safe. These poor boys are not having much fun. But you know what? I really enjoy it. I'm enjoying the differences in the people that we're meeting. Like, we know that Menion is basically a right pain in the behind, who is trying to get them to do things that they really necessarily don't want to do. I do like the fact that we have two more new characters who we haven't really been introduced to yet. Actually, technically three, because of Handel, who we haven't truly been introduced to except for a brief "I brought your friend back" moment. And they don't. So, we've got 1, 2, 3. So, Flick, Shay, and Menion, Balinor, Alanon, Handel, and the two elves. So, eight people. Small party to try and get the sword back. And I just gave something away from the next chapter, but really it's not that big of a deal. They're not going to do pictures of a character and not have him be one of the characters of the series. Oh, and of course he also saved Menion in the previous chapter. Well, it's been a long night. It's about 2:30 in the morning. Oh, and if you're wondering, anathema is a real word. I had to pause my recording and look it up so that I could pronounce the stupid word. But it means something or someone that venomly dislikes, or a formal curse by a pope or council of the church excommunicating a person or denouncing of doctrine. So it's a noun. I've never really, that's actually one that, except for in this book, I've never heard used before. So, learning how to say it was necessary. So, oh, oh, and of course, we had the singing of songs by a Miss Skitter. It's been weird. She hasn't been she wasn't really in the last video. She's not really in this one, but she hasn't been really overly snuggly either lately. We're having really weird weather right now, so I think her joints are as bad as mine. But I'm gonna cut this to an end. So we got 2 more chapters to edit, but we'll keep that momentum going. I still have 1 more chapter of Dragon Drums to edit. Then I have to record chapter 3, and I have found the breaking point for chapter 4, so that it won't be like a 5-hour video. Please give a like, comment, subscribe if you want to. If you don't, that's just fine. I appreciate the fact that you all have been here, and if you've made it this far into the video, you're absolutely amazing. Thank you. You all have a great morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you right now. I wish you all the best. Have a great one. Bye.